Kara was a character that we actually started designing even before we had fully established the actual narrative of the game.
The story sets up with her, basically with her family on a bunch of their boats, going through this storm, and effectively she gets separated on her ship from the rest of the family in the storm and ends up crashing her boat and waking up on the island. And she's basically stuck within these storms where the islands are, and she needs to find her way out of it. From the very beginning, we wanted Kara to be a nomadic character. So we wanted her to be moving through the game so that she could not only explore, but also to make her way through the narrative, to make her way through the journey she was going to go on.
Kara is a character who's just been sort of thrown into this situation. She's not here by her own choice necessarily. You need somebody who comes from a place where that's the sort of thing that's expected of them to be able to survive.
You know, she's not a superhero in any way, shape or form, so she's not going in and you know, taking out 15 animals in one go. She's vulnerable, but she is capable, and that's kind of the personality that we wanted to get across with her.
Kara is ultimately trying to get home, trying to get back to her people. This isn't the sort of place, while it's beautiful, it's also dangerous. It's not the sort of place where you want to be by yourself any longer than you need to. And while along the way it feels like she's potentially being hampered by the world, by the wind, by the storm that's trapping her there, along the way of trying to achieve that goal of getting home, she sort of uncovers a little bit of context and reasoning for why the things are the way they are. The Nautilus is introduced early on in the game. Right there in the intro, it's partly responsible for why Kara is in this situation that she is.
The idea of having this big creature that played some part in the story and how you got through the world was something that was there right from the very beginning.
Framing it as an antagonist and sort of developing it over time so that hopefully you'll sort of get a clearer idea, find out what its intentions really are, how it's actually been interacting with Kara behind the scenes the whole way.
The Nautilus, she finds out more about it as she plays through the game, and more about the world that she's in and the nature of the storms and everything around her.
It's hard to say too much without getting too spoilery. Their purpose will hopefully become more apparent as the player gets through.
I'm Brent Waller. I'm the sole environment artist on Windbound, which means I create all the backgrounds, all environments, trees, landscapes that you'll see in the game.
One of the things we wanted to do right from the very beginning was kind of take a step away from Satellite Rain, which was that dark, gritty, neon kind of world. And we wanted to do something that was really bright and colorful. You start off, and most of the islands you come across are purely natural islands. There's the wildlife running around, having the place to themselves. But as you go through, you do start to uncover elements that are man-made, and you start uncovering a bit of the story about who was there before and what happened to them, and uncovering the mystery behind the storms that surround these islands and the events that led to all of this coming about.
Part of the story is you've got this big storm, which is in itself is kind of a mysterious force that's holding you in this place, and it's kind of trapping you here as like a Bermuda Triangle type place of this untouched land, untouched by time, but has remnants of people who've been there before.
The nature of the game being procedural wasn't the plan from the beginning. That sort of came from developing internal tools for us to be able to create a big world.
Once we got more stuck into it, we realized that we could actually make the entire game like this and make our entire giant island procedurally generated. And then when we eventually moved on to having multiple islands, it made sense that each of those islands would then be their own procedural generation.
Well, with a procedural system, it can get very difficult to avoid sameness. We're handcrafting all of the trees, all of the rocks, all of the grass, all the things you'll see in the world, but it's how they're populated and placed across the landscape, and the landscape itself is all randomly generated. So you need those big, iconic and contrasting visuals to kind of break up that monotony a little bit. We've got these big pink forest biomes that are they're somewhat rare. You might see them in one every 3 or 4 forest biomes, but they're very visually striking and you won't forget it. We have to use visuals to funnel the player where we want them to go. So early on we had ruins and things that were around the land that were very similar in tone to the rocks that were around, and players were kind of just getting lost and ignoring them. So we have a whole sort of complex system of rules and numbers and percentages and probabilities that dictate how the terrain looks, whether it's coloured a certain way, what type of trees it spawns, what type of rocks it spawns, how dense those things are, and all of these things work together to kind of create a unique experience each time you play.
We wanted to straddle that idea that it is a kind of believable and relatable world.
If you need to find some wood, for example, you go to a forest, or if you need some bamboo, they'll be in a bamboo forest.
Relatively later in the development, Brent started creating these little bespoke little islands that'll appear around the world. They're a little bit more unique. They've got little bits of treasure or resources that can help you, and I really love just seeking out those things and going there and running the boat up into the sand, running up, getting some nice little bonus, hopping back on the boat and sailing away.
I knew this was going to happen because I had 3 words and now I need to remember what they were.
Adventure.
Survival.
And Windbound for me is probably about exploration, discovery, and adventure.
Ancient? No. I'll go with mystic.
Windbound is a crafting survival game that marries the experience of the open world procedurally generated experience with a story and narrative that drives you through the whole adventure, and coupling that with you being on a boat carrying your base through the whole thing as you go makes it a really unique experience. So when we started, we basically just had Kara, the protagonist, collecting resources, crafting slings and bow and arrows and kind of things like that. That was great, but at some point Mitch looked out onto the ocean that was surrounding the island and said, well, I kind of want to go out there.
So at the beginning of the game, Kara finds herself shipwrecked and basically just needs to survive. She comes from a people who have made their living off the land. They're hunters and gatherers, but then they also, just as much as important as the land to them is the sea. We
wanted her to be a character that was able to survive in the situation. She isn't completely out of her depth. So when she washes up on shore, she knows what she needs to do to hunt and gather food to survive. She knows the resources she needs to start crafting her initial canoe and to start crafting sails and to eventually get off that first island onto the next and the next until she can eventually make her way back to her family.
Early on, when you first start the game, you'll more or less see the same types of islands. So it is procedurally generated, but then as you play through the game, there'll be more types of islands with different biomes and different visuals and lighting. It's quite intentionally very friendly early on, and then as you progress through the game, you'll start getting introduced to more obstacles within the environment, both the environment itself and the creatures, that make things feel more hostile. So as the player goes through, they'll go through forests and deserts and swamps and savanna-y kind of landscapes. And every player will see that differently, going more into the belly of the beast as you're going through it.
when we initially came up with the idea with the boat, I'd been going out on a few sailing adventures with my brother at a lake near his place. And as soon as we mentioned the idea of putting a boat into the game, I immediately wanted to try and replicate having that experience of really raising and lowering the sails and tightening the sails in and out. Once you get your head around how that actually works, is really rewarding and a really fun experience.
The boat was a great way to have players be able to still get that level of commitment and investment in something that they care about and rely on, but also be able to not feel tied down to one single location. Obviously there are still risks involved, like you've got reefs and you've got rocks and you've got waves and all that sort of thing, which don't play nice with a boat, but you're never tied down to one place. You rely on your boat to not only collect resources, but it's also your way to get back home, ultimately.
Working on the creatures especially, I think is probably my favourite part, as well as being the most challenging.
They've all got this level of kind of a bit of familiarity, but they're also very obviously distinct and different from the things you might expect to see.
The blink, the sort of little rabbit thing, that's actually just me going like, and you speed it up, you get this sort of thing.
Rather than being covered in regular fur, you'll see on their ears, they've got like these sort of, we call them blink fronds. They're almost like a feathery type of thing. And you'll use that for crafting crafting your arrows and things like that. Pond wampers, which will fire toxic sort of sludge at Kara and temporarily poison her or anything else that's around.
It's got this big burp, it does. And so I actually had to do this sort of sound and slow that right down. And then it sounds like this giant, tremendous burp.
Having the Nautilus there was one of the things we had right at the very beginning. Yeah, the idea of having this big creature that played some part in the story and how you got through the world was something that was there right from the very beginning. The Nautilus, she finds out more about it as she plays through the game, and more about the world that she's in and the nature of the storms and everything around her.
It's obviously got a lot of power behind it. It's something that gives the impression of being ancient. Perhaps doesn't take kindly to the presence of Kara or her tribe sailing so closely.
I would hesitate to say more than that without just telling you what happens at the end.